right, everyone. Well, welcome. Welcome to Church of the Holy Trinity tonight for our Climate Week discussion called Climate Conversations, why the UN's Climate Summit is important to all of us. Really glad to have you here tonight. Let me just begin with a few thank yous to begin here. First of all, thank you to this congregation of Church of the Holy Trinity, which has been here. Which has been here for over 100 years and continues to support great events like this. Particular thanks go to our pastor here at Holy Trinity, Mark Collins, without whom this event wouldn't have been possible. Our parish administrator, Erlinda Brent. Is Erlinda here? She's looking for napkins. Okay, she's looking for napkins. She was most helpful in the planning of this event, and glad to have all of you here. Do want to mention in particular that, of course, what did I do? Sorry. Of course, this is Climate Week, as I said, and one of the main reasons we're here, of course, is to get you all pumped up and ready to go to the People's Climate March. It's going to be this Sunday. Now, we're all going to go to the People's Climate March, right? I would be remiss if I did not thank very much these great organizations that have come here and have tabled and offered great stuff. There's Food and Water Watch right here. We have 350 NYC, a wonderful organization that I also do work with. Thanks to 350 NYC. And we also have the Sane Energy Project back here. I hope that after we've done our presentations tonight, you might stop by the tables. I picked up this great t-shirt that 350 NYC has, all about evolution. You know, you see the course of evolution going from fire to petroleum to wind power. And they also have that t-shirt that Mike is wearing over there, and some of the others are wearing. Just a couple of items here before we get started. The fire exits we have two of them. It's the door you came in as well as the door over here. If you need to use the restrooms, step outside, go right out this door, turn right, go down the stairs, and you'll find the ladies' room immediately on your right. The men's room will be down the hall on your left. Okay? So let's get started. Each of these fine people is going to make a great presentation tonight. Then I will speak for just very briefly, and then we're going to take your questions. Now, sorry again. We have distributed these forms. If you don't have a question form, raise your hand, and we can get one to you. I would suggest think a little bit before you ask your question. Maybe don't write down your question after the first person has spoken, but wait for all the people to have said something, and then you can direct a question either to one of the individual speakers or to all the speakers here. And then we'll collect them, and at random, I'll read a few of the questions. And then after that, we can just socialize individually. So to get started here, our first presenter tonight is going to be, over here at the end of the table, will be Ms. Lisa DiCaprio. I'll say about Lisa, she's a professor of social sciences at NYU, where she teaches courses on sustainability. She's a member of 350 NYC and the Sierra Club, and is involved in campaigns for divestment and the transition from fossil fuels to renewable forms of energy. She'll be discussing what's the current status of climate negotiations.
In my presentation, I will provide an overview of the Kyoto Protocol and the significance of the negotiations for a new global climate treaty that will conclude in Paris in December 2015. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, was adopted at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio and entered into force in 1994. The purpose of the UNFCCC is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, quote, at a level that will prevent anthropogenic, that is caused by human activity, interference with the climate system, end quote. The UNFCCC requires all parties to publish national inventories of their anthropogenic emissions which also identify the sources of these emissions. The U.S. signed and ratified the UNFCCC in 1992 and fulfills this commitment by submitting greenhouse gas inventories developed annually by the EPA. In 1995, the parties of the UNFCCC concluded that its provisions were inadequate. The Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997, but did not enter into force until 2005, when it was ratified by 55 countries in the UNFCCC that were responsible for 55% of global carbon dioxide emissions in 1990. The main features of the Kyoto Protocol are as follows. Countries that ratify the Kyoto Protocol agree to reduce 6 greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide and methane. The industrialized nations, identified as Annex 1 parties, must meet mandatory reduction targets, from which the developing nations, identified as non-Annex 1 or developing country parties, are exempted. There are 2 commitment periods for the Kyoto Protocol, 2008 to 2012 and 2013 to 2020. In the first period, 37 industrialized nations and the European Community, the predecessor to the European Union, committed to an overall 5.2% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2012, using a baseline of 1990 levels. Without this reduction, the increase in emissions would have been 29% by 2010. Specific national goals included a 12.5% reduction for the UK and 6% for Japan. Annual meetings are held by the Conference of the Parties, which are referred to as COP meetings. The next meeting will be held in December in Lima, Peru, and the 2014-2015 negotiations for a new global climate treaty will conclude at the COP21 December 2015 meeting in Paris. From the outset of the Kyoto Protocol, the US and China have contended over their commitments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In 1997, the Byrd-Hagel Sense of the Senate non-binding resolution, which passed 95-0, opposed US ratification of the protocol because it exempted developing nations and, quote, would seriously harm the economy of the United States, end quote. The Clinton administration signed the Kyoto Protocol in 1998, but did not bring it to the Senate for ratification, where it faced certain defeat. Asserting a right to develop, China has claimed that the US, as the world's historically largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, must act before China to accept mandatory restrictions on its emissions. For their part, the least developed nations have challenged the exemption of large developing nations from the Kyoto Protocol, emphasizing that they have contributed the least amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but are experiencing the most severe climate change impacts, which in some cases are threatening their very existence. The contention between the US and the large developing nations has obstructed the establishment of a new legally binding goal for greenhouse gas emissions for the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which began in 2013 and will conclude in 2020. The COP15 meeting in Copenhagen in 2009 concluded with the non-binding Copenhagen Accord, which allowed UNFCCC parties to set voluntary, quote, economy-wide emissions targets for 2020, end quote. The US and the major developing nations agreed to make these commitments. The Obama administration pledged a reduction of 17% by 2020 using a baseline of 2005. 2 years later, at the COP17 meeting in Durban in 2011, the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action was established to develop a new greenhouse gas reduction protocol applicable to all parties, developed and developing nations, to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. By this time, China's share of global emissions had increased so dramatically since 1997 that it was the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, responsible for 8.7 gigatons out of 32.6 gigatons of the global total, as compared to the 5.5 gigatons of emissions generated by the US, which still exceeds China in per capita emissions. The working group for the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action is to conclude its deliberations by 2015 so that a new protocol can be adopted with legal force at the COP21 meeting in December 2015 Paris and be implemented for the period beyond 2020. The new protocol is to review the climate change science to determine if the 2 degrees Celsius limit for a rise in global warming, which was set in Copenhagen in 2009, is too high, or if a lower 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is required. And it will also discuss how to ensure that collective action is sufficient to prevent the average global temperature from rising beyond this level. The negotiations in 2014 and 2015 will depend on these 5 main factors. 1, the response to President Obama's intention, as related in the news media in late August, that the US will propose a politically binding international agreement that would, quote, name and shame countries into reducing their emissions. Encompassing the large developing nations, such as China and India, the agreement is envisioned as a substitute for a new legally binding treaty, which would require ratification by 2/3 of the US Senate, a requirement that cannot be met given its current composition. 2, US leadership in proposing an ambitious commitment to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, which recognizes the historic responsibility of the US for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and the fact that the US is one of 12 countries that currently generate 70% of all global emissions. 350 NYC is launching a national petition calling for President Obama to commit the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2030 using a baseline of 2005. This scientifically feasible reduction is to be achieved by energy conservation and efficiency and renewable forms of energy. 3, global mobilizations, such as the People's Climate March, and initiatives throughout 2014, 2015, to compel governments to take immediate and decisive action to stop climate change. 4, increasing public awareness, including within corporate financial sectors, about how climate change impacts are adversely affecting the entire global economy and the economic benefits of transitioning to a green, clean economy that will guarantee us a future. And 5, recent scientific studies emphasizing how the window of opportunity is rapidly closing to prevent catastrophic climate change. Most recently, on September 9th, the World Meteorological Association, which calculates atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions, reported that, quote, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually increased last year at the fastest rate for nearly 30 years, end quote. I would like to conclude with a quote by Christopher J. Lowiak, President of the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Chair of the Pacific Islands Forum. In his article, UN Climate Summit, The Chance to Prove That We Are Climate Leaders, which was posted on July 2nd, 2014, he said, quote, when world leaders gather at the United Nations this September for Ban Ki-moon's Climate Change Summit, it will be the first time in 5 years that heads of state and governments have stopped to focus collectively on the gathering storm called climate change. For a country like my own, lying at an average of just 2 meters above sea level, and already battling the devastating impacts of a warming world, there is no higher calling. Are we willing to let another decade slip away, standing idly by as the world's most vulnerable countries and people, including my own, fight a losing battle against the king tides and typhoons of a warming world? Or will we instead stand together and say we are ready to embrace a carbon-free future and to do it today? With just 18 months to go, he wrote this in July, with just 18 months to go before a deadline in Paris, Ban Ki-moon's summit is our chance to be the leaders we were elected to be. We must all be there, end quote. We will also be there in the People's Climate March on Sunday to demonstrate that we have heard and are answering the appeals of the world's people for a global climate treaty in 2015. We too will be judged by history.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Our next speaker is Yvonne O'Neal. Yvonne is the Overseas Gender Officer for Africa Development Interchange Network and represents the Cameroonian NGO at the United Nations. She's a member of the CoNGO Committee on Sustainable Development and co-chair of the Subcommittee for Women and Sustainable Development. She is also a member of these CoNGO committees: Financing for Development, the Committee to Stop Trafficking in Persons, the NGO Committee on the Status of Women. She began her affiliation with the UN through the Anglican Communion Office at the United Nations and served on its advisory council. Yvonne, I should add, is also a member of Holy Trinity here, where she currently serves as a vestry member and a member of our Peace and Restorative Justice community. She'll be discussing what should we expect from the UN's Climate Summit.
Well, I believe my first encounter with the United Nations was the launch of the MICA Challenge, an organization that involved Christians with the Millennium Development Goals to work on issues of poverty and social justice. When one spends a lot of time going to meetings at the United Nations, one can't help but be cynical. It is amazing to sit and listen to the government representatives talk about how committed they are to any number of issues, but in reality, some of them just say what sounds good and do not practice what they preach. Next Tuesday, on September 23rd, the UN's Climate Summit 2014 takes place, hosted by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Some 120 plus countries will be represented by their heads of state and government or deputies, including our own President Barack Obama. What can we expect from this summit? Here is one opinion that I found on the web, and I quote, "Unfortunately, these climate summits are pretty much a waste of time, as everyone gets around, agrees that climate change is a very serious problem. Everyone commits to doing something to fix a problem, and then nothing ever gets done. A big waste of time, if there ever was one," and I end the quote. Hopefully, it won't be as dismal as this person's opinion. Luckily, besides government officials and leaders, there are others taking part in the summit. People from academia, business leaders, and civic society organizations. And of course, there's the People's Climate March on Sunday, which will mobilize an extremely large crowd of grassroots people from around the globe, this country, this state, and this city. And I just learned today that UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon will also be marching. Now that is a great endorsement for the People's Climate March. And he'll be marching along with senators, former heads of states, and various celebrities. This march is being billed as the largest climate mobilization ever. The Climate Summit will have to produce tangible results. Now, next Tuesday's Climate Summit takes place at a time that the UN is abuzz with its post-2015 development agenda, which has been accompanied by a worldwide campaign asking for all our inputs in imagining the world we want. Let me go back in time to the year 2000, when the UN General Assembly in its 55th session produced the United Nations Millennium Declaration, out of which came the 8 Millennium Development Goals, known as the MDGs. The MDGs were formulated to provide a set of concrete and measurable objectives to guide UN agencies and others in a global effort to eradicate poverty, promote gender equality, and ensure sustainable development. These goals will sunset next year in 2015. Civil society and notably faith-based organizations have worked tirelessly to bring these goals to fruition, and we are looking ahead to what happens in the next 15 years. The MDG, which has relevance for climate change, is MDG number 7, which states, ensure environmental stability. 5 years after the launch of the MDGs at the 2005 World Summit at the high-level plenary meeting of the 60th session of the UN General Assembly, world leaders committed to take on climate change through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which Lisa just talked about. In September 2008, the UN held a high-level event on MDGs, bringing together governments, foundations, businesses, and civil society groups to rally around the call to action to slash poverty, hunger, and disease by 2015. New commitments to meet the Millennium Development Goals were announced. For example, under MDG 7, to ensure environmental sustainability, the Church World Service identified areas for collaboration among the faith communities, quote, for the healing of nations, international justice, dimensions of climate change, end quote. The African Union and the European Union committed to implement Africa-EU Partnership on Climate Change to advance common agenda on climate change, land degradation, and desertification. The G8 committed to at least 50% reduction of global emissions by 2050. G8 members at that time pledged to the climate investment funds approximately $6 billion and committed to mobilize public and private investments of over $100 billion for the Clean Energy Investment Framework and to increase investment in research and development. The 2010 Summit on the Millennium Development Goals concluded with a global action plan to achieve development goals by 2015. For example, the United States announced a commitment of $50.82 million over the next 5 years for Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, a public-private partnership led by the United Nations Foundation seeking to install 100 million clean burning stoves in kitchens around the world. The Asian Development Bank planned to double its financing for clean energy to $2 billion each year by last year, 2013. With the Rio 20+ Conference on Sustainable Development held in Brazil in June 2012, discussions began on the post-2015 development agenda. The outcome document of the conference is titled The Future We Want, and it launched a worldwide campaign for people everywhere to have input in shaping the post-2015 development agenda. An open working group was formed. Its mandate was to present a report to the 60th General Assembly. And I must say that the president of the 60th General Assembly, Dr. John Ash, has sought the input of civil society and has met with us on a number of occasions, including last Tuesday, just as his term was ending, because now the 69th session is in place. Civil society inputs will be contained in the final report on the post-2015 agenda of the Secretary General of the United Nations, which is due around the end of this year. Broadly, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are still a work in progress. They're lofty goals which want to end poverty in all its forms everywhere, end hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Goal number 3 is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. Ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Promote sustained, inclusive, sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Goal 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impact. And this goal acknowledges that the UNFCCC is the primary international intergovernmental forum for negotiating the global response to climate change. Goal 14 is to conserve the sustainability use of the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. 15, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss. Okay, the High Political Forum on Sustainable Development is the main UN platform dealing with sustainable development. And it provides political leadership and guidance. And it also enhances the integration of economic, social, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, which are the 3 pillars of sustainable development. 3 weeks ago, from August 27th to 29th, I, along with some 4,000 people from around the world, attended the 65th DPI NGO, Department of Public Information, Non-Governmental Organizations Conference at the United Nations headquarters here in New York. The title of the conference was 2015 and Beyond, our Action Agenda. Out of this conference came a declaration, and the declaration states in part, we declare our vision for the post-2015 development agenda is that of an equitable, inclusive, and sustainable world where every person is safe, resilient, lives well, and enjoys their human rights, and where political and economic systems develop well-being for all people within the limits of our planet's resources. Consequently, it is a world where all human rights are realized, inequalities have been properly addressed and remedied, and with poverty haven't been eradicated. The health of our planet, its natural resources, and the environment are treasured and safeguarded, where there's social justice and where peace, safety, and human security are a reality for all, including refugees and people displaced by human-induced and natural disasters. There's not time for me to go into what the conference said about Goal 13, which is on climate change and its impact. So in the interest of time, I just want to leave you with the words of the prophet Micah. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. By focusing on these words, together we can strive for human justice, human rights, and dignity, and in doing so, care for this fragile earth, our island home. And it is my hope that the summit next week will bring about a transformative agenda to achieve these goals.
Thank you, Lisa. Our third speaker tonight, and again, thanks, Yvonne. Our third speaker tonight is Dr. Philip Orton. Dr. Orton is a research professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, specializing in storm surges and coastal flooding. He holds a PhD in physical oceanography from Columbia University and a master's in marine science from the University of South Carolina. His newest research examines the coastal flooding hazard and adaptation options around the tri-state area, with a particular focus on the New York Harbor waterways. He's a technical team member of the New York City Panel on Climate Change, where his work involves remapping FEMA flood zones with sea level rise and climate change. In the winter and spring of 2013, he worked on New York City's special initiative on rebuilding and resilience after Sandy, using a storm surge model to quantify the influence of adaptation strategies on coastal flooding. In his nearly 20 years of research, he has studied air-sea interaction, turbulent mixing, sediment transport, carbon dioxide and ocean acidification, and relationships between fish, climate, and ocean physics. Tonight he'll be discussing how will climate change impact New York City and the surrounding region.
Thanks, Steve. And I also live at 93rd and 1st Avenue, so I'm right here in the neighborhood if people want to talk about the neighborhood or flooding issues in the neighborhood, for example. Can you hear me? Great. So I was asked in part to speak to climate change and its impacts on New York City, but I'll also go beyond that to the moral side of the issue, looking beyond ourselves. So there's 3 main future direct impacts of climate change on New York City. One obvious one with global warming will be heat waves being more frequent. And I'm on the, as he mentioned, I'm on the New York City Panel on Climate Change, and the forecast, if you could call it a forecast, for the 2050s decade, we put out forecasts for many decades into the future, but just choosing that decade, it is that there would be a doubling or tripling approximately of days above 90 degrees per year. So from what we have now, which averages about 15, this year we were lucky we only had 5. So it really varies from year to year, hot summers, cold summers. The average would go up to, at the low end, it would double, and at the high end, it might even triple by the 2050s. So everybody here knows that would be disgusting. We don't want to have that kind of climate in New York City. It's already bad enough much of the time. Another major impact would be rainfall, intense rainfall events, and we already have seen that in the past several decades. We've had an increase in heavy rainfall events, and so it's also projected to potentially keep increasing even worse. So those heavy rainfall events, and then the last one, the one I know the most about, I study from day to day, is sea level rise. And there's still a lot of uncertainty in how much sea level rise we're going to get. But in spite of that uncertainty, we do know the lower end of that is a rising sea level. It's not going to go the other way. It's one of the more confident projections of climate change is that we've already had some sea level rise, globally about a foot so far, and we're going to continue to get more sea level rise. And I'll give more details on that too in a moment. So I'm an oceanographer, and that's mainly going to be what I speak to right now. But I'll also talk a little bit more broadly. So after Sandy, as part of Plan NYC, New York City's climate change or sustainability agenda, New York City Panel on Climate Change was reconvened by Mayor Bloomberg. And we put together a report of which one part came out in 2013, and now another part that we've been working on is coming out very soon, maybe in the next week actually, which is sort of updating that last report. And there was also a report in 2010. And some of the conclusions there, I just want to spell out in the more technical side of what I'm going to speak to. First, by the 2050s, and like I said, we looked at many decades in the future, but by the 2050s, the expected median estimate of sea level rise is 1.5 feet for New York City. The high end is more like, for the 2050s, is more like 2.5 feet. So the low end is only something, is below, a little bit below a foot. So it's a huge range of uncertainty in what could happen. We don't understand the problem enough yet to give a really good forecast. And that's actually a really big problem when you're trying to plan building a new highway or something. To not know how much sea level rise you're going to get is already impact of climate change. To have uncertainty in flood zones, for example, to not know if your 30-year mortgage, 30 years later, you're going to have 2.5 feet of sea level rise or 1 foot. Another issue which people, I think, which is worth reminding people of the scientific consensus is with storms. So people often think, and the media gives you the sense that storms are definitely getting worse. Rainfall storms have definitely been getting worse in the Northeast, but the New York City Panel on Climate Change and the IPCC, the International Organization of Scientists looking at climate change, there's not a really clear consensus that storms are getting worse yet, and there's not a clear consensus that hurricanes are going to get worse in the future. And I can speak to the details of that if people want to ask questions about that, but that's not clear. And winter storms also definitely not clear. So the sea level rise is what I like to focus on, and also the moral sides, and I'll get back to that in a minute, of climate change. So speaking in more detail about what that 2050s scenario of 1.5 feet of sea level rise would mean for New York City, for this region, there would be a lot more areas that would have nuisance flooding, areas that are low-lying areas where during regular high tides, like we just had a king tide last week, you would have flooding. And also when there's, another thing about sea level rise is it blocks the sewers. When it rains, you often get flooding that you wouldn't have otherwise. So areas like Old Howard Beach right now, Hoboken where I work actually, they flood regularly multiple times per year with rainwater that just won't drain. And so they have heavy duty pumps and they're trying to pump their way out of it. Well, as sea levels rise another 1.5 feet, you'll have a lot more neighborhoods that are having that kind of problem. There will obviously be a higher risk of devastating flooding like Sandy occurred, although Sandy was about 6 feet higher than the seawalls, the flood height. So the extra foot, we're actually studying this, myself with Climate Central, a nonprofit, we're studying how much extra damage, maybe something on the order of $10 billion, was caused by that extra 8 inches of man-made sea level rise. So it was just, if you go 6 feet above the seawall, if you only had 8 inches less, you think, well, you would have flooded anyway, a lot of those places. But actually the damages would have been, substantially less, about on the order of $10 billion less damages caused by Hurricane Sandy. And that's just due to the sea level rise problem. And then many other areas of the world will experience more dramatic, New York City has a lot of high ground. We don't have a lot of those low neighborhoods that currently flood frequently, and we also do have a lot of high ground. So we're relatively fortunate when you look ahead to the 2050s, to a few feet of sea level rise. But there's areas like Miami and lots of developing nations, island nations, which are in much more severe consequences if you have 1.5 feet of sea level rise. And then one last point is that along these lines is beaches will become less natural. Already you see that beaches are having severe erosion problems, but as sea level rise accelerates, it'll become more and more expensive to feed them for the government, and it'll be increasingly necessary for the government or someone to dredge sand onto beaches. And the Jersey Shore already is basically an engineered coast. So that's a real severe problem that really concerns me. That we're headed in that direction. So, in media, my opinion is, but that media and also often advocates focus on the storms and the scary things and the tornadoes, and they focus a lot on that. But what I want to speak to in closing here is that the moral side of this issue is really what drives me passionately to hope that, and advocate for doing something about the problem. Because it's not really, is it really our place to make it so that future generations don't have beaches anymore and they have seawalls and maybe a little spit of beach? Is it our place to turn coral reefs into dust because of ocean acidification, the carbon dioxide going into the ocean? Is it our place to turn snowy peaks in New York State into mud in the future and make it so there's almost no snow anymore? And maybe this is looking 200 years into the future or 50 years. It doesn't really matter. It's something that is on track to happen. And then populations, is it really our place to make it so that future generations and populations around the world, especially in developing nations, are struggling to survive because the climate is changing where they are, and it's potentially no longer as habitable because they don't have snowpack in the Himalayas to provide water, or they have sea level rise into Bangladesh that's putting things more underwater. So that's my biggest concern and what really drives me, and that's why the stakes are so high as sort of raised here to do something with this UN summit. We really need to start turning the corner and getting global agreements that address this problem. Thank you.
Our fourth and final speaker of the evening will be Beth Ackerman. Beth is the chair of the Beloved Earth community, formed to tackle climate change at the Riverside Church. She's currently a fellow of GreenFaith, a religious environmental leadership training program, as I, by the way, am also a GreenFaith fellow. So I'm very happy to have another one in the room tonight. And we have a third one here in the front row. After a long career as a documentary film editor, Beth is now involved in photography and climate change nonprofit work. I will add, by the way, before I let Beth start here, Beth and her Beloved Earth community over at Riverside Church are putting together a bang-up course that's going to start on Sunday, September 28th and run for 9 Sundays about fossil fuel divestment in communities of faith. If any of you are interested in learning about it, I would highly recommend it. And you could speak to Beth afterwards about that. But anyway, Beth tonight will be discussing what's the role of faith communities in organizing for a sustainable future.
Thank you, Steve. Can you hear me? How's that? Okay. Well, I'd like to relate to this question of the faith community's role in the climate crisis in 3 ways. First, my experience at the Riverside Church with the Beloved Earth community. Second, some of the wonderful experiences we've had collaborating with other entities around town. And finally, my spiritual and kind of practical philosophy about the issue and why I'm working so hard on it. So, does anyone know this one? And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis, right? I was at a retreat the other weekend, and it was for a group of church ministries at Riverside. There were various groups there, not just our own little group. And we went around and did an exercise where everyone shared how their early life's experiences impacted their current spirituality. And almost to a person, they said, well, I was out in nature and it spoke to me. And it really was the beginning of my spirituality. This was kind of mind-boggling to me that these people didn't have the same agenda I did, and yet there they were saying this. And so I thought that we in the environmental community sometimes feel like we only have a limited focal point of people that we're like preaching to the choir. But maybe it's really hardwired into almost everyone that the earth is something that we have to protect. So we can maybe use that going forward. We started off small. We had a very small group of people who were interested in having Bill McKibben come and speak to us. We wanted to raise the awareness in our own congregation and draw in some people from the outside. We were wildly surprised by the fact that 850 people showed up. So it was encouraging that you can get a lot done with a small group of people. And we found this to be true going forward. There is, just parenthetically, in a large cathedral-type church, a steep learning curve on how you operate within that structure. So I would give the following advice. Pick your people who have thick skin and they're willing to work very hard, because that's the winning ticket. We've arranged many different events, and we've tried all types of things, like films. We had Gasland 2. I see Angela Fox in the back. Hello. And we've had other films, and we've done letter writing. We've testified at hearings. And definitely some of the most gratifying work we've done is with the other environmental groups in town. So we keep showing up and speaking up. But one of the biggest enterprises that we did undertake was a little surprising to us again, what happened with this particular story. We wanted to make a large statement about our feeling about fracking. So what they do at Riverside Church is when they have an impactful statement that they want to make, they call it a resolution. So it takes a lot of grassroots organizing to have one of these resolutions get passed. So there was a lot of work done. And to cut to one of the first setbacks was when we took our first meeting and where we were going to vote on this particular resolution. The item was down at the very end of the agenda. The 2 hours set aside for this meeting elapsed, and lo and behold, it was not voted on. So this was a learning moment for us, because we were, of course, wringing our hands. We were very upset. But quickly a light bulb went on. Of course, that was an LCD light bulb. And we said, wait a second, this gives us more time to educate the congregation even further. So that's another little takeaway that we've had, is sometimes when things appear to be a setback, they're not. I'm sure you've all experienced things like that in your life as well. The highlight of that interim period before the next vote was when we took a trip with Food and Water Watch down to Pennsylvania, and we were really lucky because one of our council members went with us. The church had really not known very much about fracking before some of our experienced congregants here got started on the fracking resolution, but so the fact that he showed up on the bus and saw everything we saw, he saw the company vans following us all around Pennsylvania, he saw the divisions that were created in the community, and then he saw Ray. I don't know, some of you have maybe met Ray, who's the man who's had his water contaminated, the water that comes out of his faucet, and he'll show you it's gray and horrible. And he told us the story about how the EPA was in his living room and said, that water's perfectly fine to drink. You just go right ahead and drink it. And so at our next congregational meeting, this same council member stood up and he said, "No, I've seen it with my own eyes. Fracking is wrong, and we should really take a stand on this in our church." So we think that had a huge impact. So I would say that's the God effect. You know, small miracles happen along the way. Maybe not everybody here goes to church, but you can call it whatever you like. We felt very blessed at that moment. Finally, the punchline of the story is that we finally took a vote, and this congregation, who didn't really know about fracking 6 months earlier, voted almost unanimously in favor of this resolution. I have to say, if only we can get the church to publicize it more, we'd be very, very happy. No, I'm almost done. So here's the bit about my philosophy. How's my time doing? Okay. All right, the philosophy is, the headline of my philosophy is, churches can help the climate movement can help churches. And it's kind of intuitive and obvious, really, if you think about it, because church membership is declining. Everybody knows about that. You can argue about why that's happening, but again, it presents an opportunity for a church that's already an institutionalized structure of people who care about things from a deep moral place to stand up and speak up about something. And that can attract, then, in turn, people who are perhaps younger, who clearly this is going to be affecting their lives and their children's lives. I'm just hoping that those two tendencies can meet and be a mutually beneficial experience for both. I'm really so excited by the organizing that's happened around the climate march that's coming up, because I can see, and GreenFaith has been very, very active in organizing the People's Climate March, the faith contingent of it. Fletcher Harper is the head of the GreenFaith, and he's also been a major leader in getting together the faith community. So I'm going to read you a tiny bit of something I saw off the internet that has to do with our universe. I don't know if anyone here saw the recent video about our galaxy and where it is in the place of the cluster, the supercluster of the universe. We're just like way out here in this tiny little place, and they're calling the whole system Laniakea, which is Hawaiian for immeasurable heaven. And so throughout the universe, these webs of galaxies are interconnected with dark voids in between. So I think our job as a faith community is both to organize within our churches, make those strong, strong webs of connections, but also reach out to the outer community, make those webs as strong as we can. And so when you see me marching in a couple of days' time, it will be with the largest group ever of faith communities who have gotten on the streets of New York City to speak up for the planet, and as Fletcher Harper says, praying with their feet.
I might just take the liberty of just taking a couple of minutes to make a couple of closing remarks here. First of all, I really appreciate what all four of you have done. I think this has been a really fine event. And I would just add a couple of ideas here. First, I think, you know, we hear over and over again that we're going through a worldwide ecological crisis. And I don't think that in the environmental community or the faith community or the faith environmental community, whatever, that we sufficiently recognize that it's not just an ecological crisis. It's in my view, it's an economic crisis. And I think at some point we have to look at the fact that we have an economic system which is predicated on the constant accumulation of more and more, constant growth, And, you know, as this one famous economist, Kenneth Boulding, once remarked, there are only two groups of people in the world who think that infinite growth is possible in a finite world: madmen and economists. So, you know, most people will simply say in response to this, well, that's just the way that our economic system is. You can't change it, you have to work within it. I don't think that's true. I mean, the economic system that all of us know has really been in effect for only roughly somewhere between 400 to 500 years. It can change. And what really troubles me is that we've got to think bigger, because I think that there's a lack of sustainability built into our current system. So that's my first one little point, and then I'll just briefly say before I go to your questions. We had a great diversity of viewpoints here tonight, and I appreciate that. We couldn't get every possible viewpoint on climate change in tonight, and I think Lisa maybe just touched on this very briefly, but I'll just say a little bit more about it. We didn't really get into the whole aspect of climate change that has to do with environmental justice. The fact that by and large, the effects of climate change are felt most strongly by those communities that have done the least to cause it. In most cases, that is communities of color and communities of poor people. And we have to, you know, particularly in the context here we're a community of faith where we're holding this event, but I think for us, just in this community, you know, in this environmental community in general, we've got to keep the notion of justice at the forefront here, because climate change is a massive intergenerational injustice, which we are saddling coming generations with an enormous cost of trying to maintain a sustainable planet, but also in the more immediate future, it's a great injustice, as I said, to those communities of color and those who are poorest in the world who will suffer the brunt of these effects. So I just wanted to make those points. Okay, thank you. I've got a few questions here. I'm going to just shuffle them up at random, and I'll ask a few. First one here that comes around on the guitar is to Philip. The question is, for every fact we have that climate change is real and that we are experiencing its negative impacts right now, the climate change deniers have a piece of information that negates it. Sometimes they even sound logical. How do you advise non-scientists to combat this? Is it even possible?
Back there? I mean, that is very tough. You know, the first time I was doing climate advocacy, I was on a radio show, and the radio host was a libertarian. And he, you know, people can go to websites and they can pull off, even this was 10 or 15 years ago, they can, you know, things are even more sophisticated now. They can pull off a series of arguments that often are very misleading. And it's really difficult to even for scientists to be ready for those offbeat tricks, tricky critiques. So I'm not sure what the solution is in terms of beating that. I mean, I think it's good if you want to speak. I think it's good, possibly an approach to deal with it is just to have the basic facts and to put them out there and say, look, and also to lean toward the fact that most scientists agree that it is a severe problem, and stick with that. I mean, if they, another thing you might do is if they're all, you know, they may be focused on the most common arguments like hurricanes are getting worse and things like that. But you could also say, look, you know, philosophically and morally, we shouldn't be changing the system. And, you know, they probably can't deny that we're raising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's a hard one to deny because it's easily measured. And they may not even be able to deny that we have already caused global warming to some extent. They may just be taking the tack that it's going to be harmless and it's not a big deal to change the climate, and it's not going to hurt us that badly. It's overstated, and if they go that way, then you can get them on the moral side of it, which is that we shouldn't be changing the system when we can, you know, prevent it with solar power and wind power and these things that now are becoming very much cheaper.
Thanks. The second question that popped around for me here goes to Yvonne. You mentioned that you are optimistic about the upcoming summit. What tangible progress do you expect to emerge from the meeting? You may want to pick up the mic.
Well, the leaders who are going to be attending the summit have been asked to bring things that will change the course of climate change, things that will transform the world. And so I'm hopeful that after they're seeing hearing the people's voices, seeing the march, seeing all that's leading up to the march, that they know that they have to come and offer something tangible. Now, what these tangibles are, I am not sure, but if we look at the agenda that's on place for the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a lot there that can be done and a lot that can be measured. And I can tell you that civil society has been really letting its voice be heard, saying that we want a transformative agenda, we want to end poverty, we want there to be the social justice that Steve just mentioned. And I think that the leaders of the world are hearing that, and if we all work together, that is governments, businesses, civil society, and civil society is each and every one of us here, our faith communities, the various non-governmental organizations, and we can all have a voice. And the wonderful thing about the United Nations is that it actually is now giving voices to people who didn't have voices before. So we can have a voice at the United Nations. And governments are listening. And I think everybody, all the government leaders have families, and they want their families to continue. They want their grandchildren to be able to enjoy life in a world that they can live comfortably and end poverty. So I think that it can be done, and I think that we will see a transformation happening throughout the world, and starting with this summit. I think the leaders are coming geared up to really make sure that there will be a change, and I say a change is coming.
Great, thanks. And I'll pick a question that's pitched at all of you. So whoever feels they want to pounce on this one first, go ahead, and actually more than one of you can if you like. What do each of you feel are the most important things that we all must do, aside from marching on Sunday, to get governments and corporations to do the right thing? Who would like to try that? Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, one, I'd like to emphasize that we have a new city council and a new mayor and a new speaker of the House. And there are many new possibilities for initiatives. I was attending, and Meredith was also there, several of us involved in various environmental campaigns. 2 or 3 weeks ago, attended an environmental roundtable chaired by Donovan Richards, the new chair of the Committee on Environmental Protection. And he asked all of us to discuss what we thought would be the priorities for the next legislative session. This is the first time an environmental roundtable of this kind has been convened. So I think that's a real new possibility. There are many bills that are being revived. Previously, bills were voted out of committee, and then because, just to be honest, Christine Quinn did not want to oppose initiatives that Bloomberg did not support. Those bills never were brought to the city council floor for a vote. And so now we have an opportunity with the new Speaker of the House for bills that have been voted out of various committees to be voted on by the entire city council. So I think anyone who has ideas, make an appointment with your city council representative. They want to hear from us. And as Linda Rosenthal emphasized at the event that several of us attended last night on the future of energy, progressive leaders like herself need us. They need us to advocate for new initiatives. They need us to mobilize for those initiatives. But we also need those leaders, because without government, initiatives cannot be implemented. So it's really mutually necessary for us to work with our elected officials who are progressive, who want to protect the environment, to bring them ideas and to mobilize advocates for the successful passage of this legislation. And the second point at 350 NYC is involved in the divestment movement, which is also, as you pointed out, a priority for the GreenFaith movement. So divestment is something that you can take to your various institutions. I'm also involved in NYU Divest, as well as the 350 NYC campaign. Sierra Club also has a resolution calling for the New York City as well as the New York State Pension Fund to divest. So whatever institution you are in, endowments, nonprofit foundations also have endowments, not just universities. And in terms of the change that we need, SERI is a nonprofit organization in Boston, which was formed after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, 1989, had launched what is called Investing in the Clean Trillion campaign to raise $1 trillion for investment in clean technologies and green infrastructure, a global clean trillion investment by 2030 annually, $1 trillion in investments. Why this number, why this goal? In 2012, the International Energy Agency, IEA, estimated that in order to have an 80% chance of remaining below 2 degrees Celsius, we would need $1 trillion in green infrastructure and clean technologies. So this is another important campaign to support, because we can move funds from fossil fuels to investments in green infrastructure and clean technologies. So this is why the divestment campaign is also a divest and reinvest campaign.
Thank you, Lisa. Would any of the others like to take a stab at that? Again, what do you each feel are the most important things we all must do, aside from marching, to get governments and corporations off to do the right thing? Anyone else want to take a stab at that? Otherwise, I think actually we've been up here for a while, and you know, all the panelists have agreed to stay for a while and to answer your questions individually if you want to speak to them. We have refreshments at the back, so please stay. Please visit these tables back here with these great people from Food and Water Watch and 350 NYC and the Sane Energy Project. I'm so appreciative that they're here. And Mark, did you want to say anything?
I just want to say, please join me in thanking Steve Knight and the Peace and Restorative Justice community at the Church of the Holy Trinity for, once again, living witness to this important issue. Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much, and thanks to our panelists. And eat up, because anything you don't eat gets left in the refrigerator, and I eat it tomorrow. So please help yourselves and enjoy.